Well, now I'd like to talk about a historical example that's a little bit closer to home than some of the other ones I've done, and that is an analysis of the Ottoman Empire, its government, and how this illustrates, or at least a segment of its government, and how this illustrates why bureaucracies never work. There's a tendency, uh, not just among socialists, but basically even minarchists, that you know, yeah, maybe the government's inefficient and maybe they're corrupt and maybe this or that, but at you know, the tasks that we wanted to do are physically capable. It's physically possible to regulate. It's physically possible to build roads and to build schools. These are all things that human beings can accomplish. And so why is it so hard to imagine that government officials can't? They should be able to do it just like anybody else. Why should the virtue that they're, or maybe not the virtue, the vice that they're in government, um, make it impossible that they perform, important tasks, whether those be market failures or not? And in a word, well, there's two words. One is knowledge, which is, how would they even know what to make? That's not what I want to talk about here. The other is incentives. And to illustrate that, I want to take an example from the Ottoman Empire. Now, uh, this is a good book on the Ottoman Empire, history of the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. Now, this is actually volume 2. It starts in 1808. But I would recommend, if you're really interested in it, to get volume 1. I actually haven't read volume 2 yet, but I did read volume 1, which starts with Osman and the whole history before that. And uh, I learned a lot about really a very important state that lasted a long time. I think it has not the record, but close to a record as the longest lasting state. Byzantium, I think, has the record as the longest lasting state. And it's interesting because the Ottoman Empire is a successor state in a lot of ways to Byzantium. In 1453, is it Mehmet or Murat? And I can never remember the second, conquered Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul. But actually, the Ottoman Empire goes back, 200 or 300 years before that. Now, one of the most famous, if you, it's kind of faded with history, but if you go back to, say, like the time of Christopher Columbus and the Renaissance and the first of the very early modern period, the Ottoman Empire had a reputation as an extremely powerful nation state, and its military was feared and held in very high respect. It had a series of very successful navies under something that won a number of big battles against Spain and Italy. They lost a big battle called the Battle of Lepanto, but then their land forces were almost unbeatable. They had literally centuries of almost continual victories, especially in Europe. They actually were defeated by the Mongols, but who wasn't? Bayezid II had a disastrous defeat. Tamerlane defeated them as well. But it's we think of the Ottoman Empire as being in Turkey, but really, and it did start there. Uh, Turks immigrated to Anatolia, and there were several different groups of Turks, including the Seljuks. But Osman, that's where the name Ottoman Empire comes. He's the founder of the Ottoman Empire. Very quickly, the Turks actually became a Eastern European power. Most of their territory, most of their power came from the Balkans and not from Anatolia. And then later they went on to expand over all of Anatolia and then the Middle East, Egypt, all the way up to Iran. Now, their most famous military unit is the Janissaries, which is one of those units, one of those military organizations that is frequently cited as being kind of like the first modern military unit, which is, I hate to say it, but it's just cliche at this point because just about every successful state military is attributed to this. So the Romans, the Macedonians, the Hoplites, the Syrians, the Persians, the Egyptians, even the Lagashites. Just about anybody who, certainly the English, just about anybody who ever won a couple battles, there's probably some historian somewhere who's going to say, you know what, they're the modern. But Janissaries are one of them, and there are a couple of reasons to claim this. I'm told, it's my understanding that they were the first units that regularly trained with and specifically trained with firearms. Firearms that existed really just about the time the Ottoman Empire was founded. They kind of started to be used in the West, first as cannons and blender, not as handheld cannons. But they were very irregular in their deployment and use, and the Janissaries were training this about. I guess I should go back and how the Janissaries developed, because at the beginning, the Ottoman Empire's military was very feudal and based on the idea that there's the Sultan and then he has his nobles, and the nobles have a retinue of basically knights. They had different names for them. And, when the Sultan wanted to go to war, they would all muster. But what started to happen is the Sultan also had a large number of slaves. And it's unusual because normally when you have slaves, you don't arm them and train them to fight, but the Ottomans did. And the core of the Sultan's slaves was the Janissaries, and these became very effective, and it got to become a custom where when they conquered a new area, they would just go and they say, well, okay, you owe us taxes, and you also owe us, one of the taxes was you had to give us young boys. And ironically, we consider them the Ottoman Turks, and the Janissaries is their strong arm that dictated their will. But they were usually mostly Europeans. They were people from the Balkans, from Serbia, Croatia, Greece, Bulgaria, who were drafted at a very young age. I don't think at birth, but when they were children, they would be taken up, not kidnapped right out of their houses, but, well, maybe, but the states or the governments that they lived in would become vassals of the Ottomans, and they would have to surrender so many children. Then they would be taken and they would be brought up in barracks, and they would be basically brought up to be soldiers, and they would be forced to learn how to use bows and arrows and weapons and how to drill, and this is kind of like the ideal bureaucracy. I mean, you have a set of people, and they are trained only to do a certain task, and they are very good at it, and it's very easy to look at this and say, oh, look, see, government can work. They just have to have the right people and the right organization, and it can get the job done. Now, you might say, well, we don't like the idea that they're going around killing people and conquering countries, but maybe we don't want them to do that. We want them to be teachers or regulators or something like that. But the principle is valid. This government can create a bureaucracy that's capable of performing functions effectively. In this case, it's waging war and conquering and killing, but, if they can do that, then they might as well be able to run a welfare state as well. But the problem here, as I alluded to earlier, is incentives. The Janissaries started out as the most professional, most capable military units around that they faced. They routinely defeated very powerful opponents in Europe and in Asia, for that matter, like the Mamelukes and the Shah, and of course slews of Christians. I mean, I think there were kind of two waves of Islamophobia in Europe, and one was at the very beginning when the Abbasids and the Umayyads kind of conquered Spain, but that was in the 700s A.D. The Reconquista had essentially ended, and right when it did, it ended in 1492, but just before it, the Ottoman Turks erupt and conquer Constantinople, which is in some ways like the most Christian city in the world. I mean, there's two, at the time, there would have been two cities that could have claimed that. One would have been Rome, one would have been Constantinople, and here one of the poles falls. And, many Christian nations waged war against the Turks and lost, and so you have this very effective fighting force, but by the 19th century, Janissaries are not considered that so much as it's a byword for graft, corruption, sloth, and ineffectual bureaucracy. How did this happen? Because, like I said, of incentives. If you look, slaves, even though they're slaves, are still human beings, and they still, in order to be effective, need to be motivated. And you can't just say, You have to do what I say or I will kill you. Okay, then you will get a moniker of um, acquiescence at that point. But at every point that they can, they will slack. They will not be the bravest fighters. They will not be the best fighters. They won't be the best bureaucrats. They are self-interested. They want something else. And so to get them to do what you want, they have to be granted, um, they have to be induced somehow. And so what happened was, even though they're ostensibly slaves, the sultans began rewarding the Janissaries, first the leaders and then the rank and file. Uh, First with pay, then with estates and titles, and before you know it, they are basically a new aristocracy. And the actual Janissaries weren't even fighters anymore. When you get right down to it, at least many of them were. They became very fat. They just sat around raping little boys, among other things. And the state needed. I mean, what happened is, as a new sultan would want to become in power, and he would realize that he couldn't do it without the Janissaries, and so he would promise them, okay, if you support me, then you get to have a month off, or you all get to have 1,000 acres, or you all get to have 10 virgins, or you don't have to pay taxes or whatever. And this is to induce them to do what you want, but in effect, then they become less effective as a fighting force. They become a bureaucracy that's not doing what it's ostensibly supposed to do. And this happened with the Romans. If you look, it's kind of famous that the Romans started bribing the legions, and they would say, elect me the emperor and I'll pay you all this much money. And that doesn't necessarily affect the effectiveness of the military, but eventually there's not enough money to pay them, and so they start giving them other things, like saying, okay, instead of carrying your body's weight worth of provisions, if you elect me the emperor, I will only make you carry half that weight. And before you know it, the effectiveness of the units decreases substantially. And this is what happened to the Janissaries. They went from the top, the elite, to a joke. I mean, to absolutely backwards, to the point where they were absolutely helpless against even small European states. The image of the Ottoman Empire changed from basically an almighty superpower, an unstoppable force to be reckoned with and to be feared, into the sick man of Europe, something to be mocked. And this is just the incentive. This is the trend you're going to get in every bureaucracy, no matter how well intentioned, no matter how, when they thought of it, they really did try and say, okay, how are we going to, they wanted to make a military fighting force that was effective, which all states want to do, and lots of states think about this really hard. I mean, the Spartans thought about it really hard, and the Athenians and the Persians and the Romans and the Americans think about it really hard. And they come up with a system that it makes a lot of sense, assuming that the people involved have no other incentive other than to be good bureaucrats. But nobody has that incentive to be good bureaucrats. Everyone has the incentive to profit their own self-interest, whatever that is, to the highest degree possible. And this means that no matter what institutional breaks you put in there, there's going to be a tendency away from them to circumvent them or to change them. And that's exactly what happened with the Janissaries. They became less and less effective because they were demanding more and more power, and they became the state. That's the other danger, is if you have bureaucracies and they fail, if they're terrible, if they're not effective, then they will either be abolished or they will be absorbed by another bureaucracy. But if you have and if they are a bad bureaucracy, then what's the point arguing in favor of that? You say it's a bad bureaucracy, we don't need it. But if they're a successful bureaucracy, like say the Janissaries were or the Legionnaires were, what happens then is they become incentivized and subsidized more and more and more, which means they become lazy and expectant of these rewards, and they become entitled, and they stop being effective. And there's no magic balance to be had here. There's no formula that can avert this. It's like irrigation will eventually lead to a salination of the soil, no matter what. The only way not to do it is not to irrigate. Eventually you have to let fields sit fallow. You can't cultivate forever, and you can't have a bureaucracy that's effective forever. They lose effect. And of course, this is all, comparing state to state, not, what if we had actually marked, because the Janissaries were not defending the Ottoman people. They were defending the Sultan and, the power elite within the government of the Ottoman Empire, not regular Turks, who they would actually oppress if they didn't pay taxes, which they wouldn't have any problem with because they, by and large, weren't Turks. They were basically foreigners who were, and they were indoctrinated too. That's the other thing, is they get these guys young enough, they'd force them to learn Turkish, they'd force them to become Muslim, and they would, this is kind of, this incentive problem is something socialists, came up with the idea of a new socialist man, but it was really not a new idea. I mean, Plato talked about it, and you have the Janissaries here, the Ottomans, essentially attempting to do the same thing. Sure, people don't want to be soldiers. Let's just indoctrinate them to be good soldiers and have them be, that's all that they want, is to be good soldiers. Well, it doesn't work that way. I mean, they've tried it, and that's not the only example. There's many, many, many examples of that. It's in one of those things where the socialists think they came up with a new idea when really it was an antiquity that they came up with the idea, and they've been trying to make it work, and they still never have. We've had quite a few experiments, real-world experiments with that, and it's never worked. It's interesting because here again, it started out as very effective, and then became a byword for failure, for ineffectiveness, and that is what government incentives will do to anybody, to any institution. Regardless of how, I mean, a state needs a powerful military more than anything. That's its number one need, and they will do anything they can. And later, here's another interesting thing, that I didn't realize before reading the book. If you've ever heard the term of a Grand Vizier, I don't know if this always means this, but in the Ottoman Empire, the Grand Vizier, who was essentially in charge of the government, was also a slave. The sultans had slaves be their soldiers, but then they also had slaves just form the bureaucracy. This is very similar to having the eunuchs or whatever in China. That's not that uncommon, but you'd have the Grand Vizier, who was a slave, who would basically run the government. He'd collect all the taxes and even command the military. But it was interesting because later, some of these bureaucrats, some of these slaves, said, well, we have all the, we have these Janissaries, and they don't even show up for training. They're not even good soldiers at this point. They just live on estates, smoking opium all the time. And they would try and reform them. They would say, okay, we need to get rid of the ones who aren't any good. We need to get new ones. We need to reinstill discipline. We need to cut the fat. We need to cut the pork. Real reformers. And what usually happened to them is they ended up dead. In a couple cases, the Janissaries went, and the other people that they were trying to reform would go to the Sultan and be like, listen, we don't like this guy. He's pushing all of our buttons wrong. And it's either him or us. And I mean, there's a couple cases where they just would have the Grand Vizier be strangled to death because he was trying to reform too much. And the reform, this is something that's rare. You do see it in government. You have the real ideologue, the real reformer who really wants to make things better, honestly wants to run the government well, and even when those people exist, and it's very, very rare, there are historical examples of it, but they do exist, they can't get things done. Even the reforms they even make will just be temporary until they're ousted, because they'll be stepping. You have all these intransigents. The Janissaries like that they just live on their estates all the time and aren't really fighting, and and what he sees is wasted tax money. Most people, the people who are receiving it, see it as their dinner and their bread and butter, and so they take it real personal when he tries to cut the funding. Just like any reformer in government now who wants to cut what he calls pork and wasteful. Everything that says pork, there's somebody who, like, that's what's paying the bills and letting them live life large, or maybe not live life large, but, and they're going to resent the reform and they will oppose it to the point in Ottoman times where they would assassinate or have murdered the reformer. Here we just unelect them or shame them or call them racist. As far as I know, we aren't offing them yet, but who knows. So anyway, if you're interested in the Ottoman Empire, I highly recommend this series. I haven't read, like I said, I haven't read the second one yet, but this is the second one. But get the first one. If you read it, you'll know more about the Ottoman Empire than anybody you will likely ever meet, and I don't know, that probably would put you in a better place to understand the world today than you otherwise would be in. So I mean, that's why I read it. So all right, that's it.